Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. Super excited to be back this week for our third episode of our 3-episode How to Review a Full-Length mini-series. Today, as you guys may know, if you saw our last one on how to review a science passage, today is all about cars and how to review a cars passage. So I hope you guys are as excited as we are. Mike, I know that you don't or you didn't love cars at the beginning. Now you do. How are you feeling about this?
I can just imagine if I was a student right now, I would have listened to the first 2 episodes, like, okay, how to review full lengths, okay, got it. Right, how to review a science passage, got it. But now I'm thinking, cars, my worst enemy. Like, how am I supposed to improve? I've done millions. Why am I not improving? So if I were a student, I would be all ears right now because this is where I think, a lot of students really struggle. I know I did because I felt I was doing a lot of cars passages and I wasn't improving. I would try to review it like I did my science passages, but I don't know why. My score just stagnated every single time. And so I'm excited to kind of share, our experiences and also, the experiences of an absolute legend in the space, to see like how to actually improve and review our cars passages. So I'm pretty excited.
I know we not only have you, Mike, right, who has such a unique perspective to share with cars, but also we have our special guest who we've been teasing a little bit at the end of our past couple episodes. We are joined by the Cars King himself, actual Jack Westin. Jack, we're so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you guys for having me. Really appreciate it. And I'm excited to dive into cars.
Yeah, having your perspective on this is going to be so cool because if anyone is somehow new to this space, Jack is the one who ultimately began Jack Westin, of course, it's right there in the name, and really created such detailed strategies for cars, right? Like took this kind of subjective nightmare that cars is for most students and translated into very specific, actionable, objective strategies that are essentially just like the intellectual scalpels that we were talking about last episode, yes. But this time for cars. So super excited to have your perspective here, both of you guys. I think this is going to be a really great one. Mm-hmm. So let's first start off just kind of setting the stage. Mike, tell us a little bit about what cars is and how students should be kind of framing this discussion.
So cars is kind of the section that is kind of the odd one out on the MCAT. I think for most people would agree. It's a little bit different from the other 3 sections, where the other sections, Chem Phys, Bio, Biopsych, Soc, you have all this content you need to know, all this background information, all these things you need to memorize and understand, connections to make. In cars is the one section where arguably you can go into the exam knowing nothing, right? If you are somebody with no science knowledge whatsoever, cars is the only section that you're sort of on a level playing field with everybody else, where this is the section where you don't need any, and it's actually usually better that you don't have any background knowledge for the topics, because this is the section where they are subjecting you to a lot of literature from the different social sciences and humanities.
Wait, so I don't need to know about automobile mechanics here?
Actually, usually it's better if you don't. Surprisingly, no, right? This is the section where they're giving you literature from like the past, could be from the past 100, 200 years on art, from history to economics, right? To philosophy, right? This is the section where they're subjecting you to a lot of things they're pretty confident you don't know about. Right? Mm-hmm. But then you have to read these dense passages, and the goal here is not that you memorize all this information, but can you be given a new piece of information, digest it, understand it, and then answer questions about it, right? So this is the one section where it kind of tests these really critical analysis and reasoning skills. The name, that's what CARS stands for. And a lot of students struggle with this because it's unlike the other sections, right? You can't study and review for it like you do the science sections because it's so different.
Yeah, I feel like this brings us to the first question that I get from students all the time, right? Before we even move on, which is, why is cars a section, right? Mike, you're saying that we are talking about geography and political science and all of these like seemingly unrelated topics to medicine, art history, theater, dance. Like, why is this a section? Is it just here to make us miserable? Is it just here to test our patience, right? Like, why is this here and does it matter? And Jack, I'd love to hear your thoughts because I know, Mike and I have answered this question hundreds of times, but if we've answered it hundreds of times, you've answered it 1,000 times. What would you say is the purpose of cars?
That's a great question. I've thought about this for literally decades at this point. And I think I've come up with a reasonable like answer to that. They want to see if you're a human being, point
Yeah.
blank. Like
Yeah.
anyone can learn the sciences and spit that out. But can you actually hear someone and listen to someone and pay attention to what they're exactly saying? And I think that becomes a very important part of medicine after you learn all the sciences, right? It's how, we don't judge our doctors based on the way the way they treat us, right? In terms of clinical care. It's more about the bedside manner, right? That's the thing you remember about your doctors. How well do they treat you as a person? And I think that's why the car section is so important, is because it brings out the humanities in people, right? It helps schools identify if you can reason through humanities, right? And so that's my take on it.
I love that. Yeah. And I feel like that's usually the first hurdle students come up against when they're trying to review, especially a cars fooling section, is just like, I don't think this matters. I don't think this belongs on the MCAT. I don't want to sit down and really give each one of these passages the time and respect that they deserve because I just don't think it matters. I don't think this should be a section on the exam. But I love that and I totally agree, right? It's training you to be a human. I always say when you sit down to take a course passage, the first thing you need to do is check your entire personality at the door. Your thoughts, feelings, experiences, perspectives, all of that, right? I cease to be Molly Hudash when I sit down to take a course passage. I am a sponge. I am a blank sheet of paper, right? Because ultimately, and I say this with love, I don't matter when you read Cars. You don't matter when you read Cars. The only
Mhm.
person who matters is the author. And it's very similar to that patient provider relationship of, right, my own biases don't matter here. My experiences don't matter here. The patient is, right, the center of this relationship. It's my job to make sure that they get the care that they need and deserve, right? I need to make sure that I am focused on you and not my perspective of you or my opinion of you based on my own thoughts. So I love cars as an exercise in stepping away and basically taking something at face value, which is ultimately, I think, the skill they're trying to train into you. Again, it's helping shape compassionate care. That's so important. So if
Mhm.
you're out there thinking cars doesn't matter, it does, right?
Definitely
Mike,
does.
yeah, what do you think about this?
I think I can't echo enough what you're saying in terms of you don't matter when it comes to cars, right?
Yeah.
I always say
With love,
like
with love.
with
You
love, hey,
matter.
hey, you matter
Not now.
absolutely, just not in cars, right?
Yeah.
Because it's echoing that patient interaction where as soon as you start putting your assumptions, those justifications about why they're doing things, a challenge I hear all the time is, oh, how am I supposed to assume this thing, or how was I not supposed to assume that thing? Where it's the same thing with the patient interaction, where you have to check your assumptions at the door. You see something, there has to be a good reason for your thoughts to be guided in a certain way. Where if there's no reason for you to make a certain assumption, you can't make that assumption. So I can't agree more that it's stimulating that patient interaction. And really, every patient is coming from a different place, has a
Yeah.
different background, has a different history. And that's where I think also Cars really shines because
Yeah.
every single passage is totally unique from a different background, from a different perspective, has a different author's voice. Just like every patient has their own voice with a different background. Yeah,
Yes.
every patient is, I went into patient interaction. Every patient is the most interesting patient in the world. They are the
Hmm.
most valuable person in the world. And that's where I hear a lot of pushback from students like, oh my goodness, these passages are the most boring thing. I hate economics. I hate philosophy. It's the worst, right? Where when you're in that position, no matter what you initially think, again, we're checking you at the door. Whatever you're facing at that moment is the most interesting thing. It is the most valuable thing at that very moment. Just like if you're in a patient interaction, no matter who you're with, they're the most important person at that moment. And so I
I
think these mindsets, like echoing it, 100%.
I think about who our doctors, our future doctors are, right? 10 years from now, everyone listening to this is going to be a doctor. And you're going to go into a patient's room one day and you're going to make a decision. Are you going to treat them as a person and listen to them, or are you going to be looking at the clock, waiting to check out, waiting to go to the next patient's room? And every doctor makes that choice every single day they step into a patient's room. And not every patient is actually interesting. Some of them aren't interesting at all. They may not have anything similar to you in any capacity, right? Whether it's their race, religion, gender, whatever it is. And so you have to make a decision. Are you still going to treat that person with respect? And are you going to be present for them, right? Or are you going to just try to diagnose them and move on to the next patient? And I think everyone that's listening to this wants to be that holistic doctor that does give that great treatment to patients because they deserve it. And so, just like cars passages, you're going to get some boring ones. You're going to get some quote unquote patients that you're not going to be that interested in. It doesn't matter. You have a job, you have a duty, you signed up for this, right? And so as a physician, you're going to go into every patient's room and give every patient your all, right? Because it's your job. And so who cares if it's not interesting? You've decided you're going to take the MCAT. You've decided you're going to sit there and study for this test. And so yeah, let's face it, you're going to get some passages you don't like. Let's face it, you're going to get some passages that are very boring, but it's still your job. Don't look at the clock. Don't ignore the author because this author could one day be your patient, right? This is someone who has their own hopes, desires, fears, interests. Maybe it's not similar to yours, but it deserves their time. They deserve to be heard. They deserve to be listened to, right? And I think the hard part for students is yes, this author wrote this maybe 50 years ago. They might be dead for all we know, right? But they still wrote it on a piece of paper, and that doesn't mean that just because you can't talk back to them that they don't want to be heard, right? And so I think there's an element of listening that needs to occur at a deeper level that you have to just practice. And we can, obviously talk about that, but that is really the goal of cars. It's just listening.
Yeah, I think entering cars with that mindset, I think is the very first step. Before we get into like any analytics, any review, any all that, making sure you're coming to every cars passage with that mindset, I think is absolutely the first step. But then what's the
Yeah.
second step? Now students are like, okay, I'm tackling these cars passages now. I'm always thinking about the pitfalls, right? 'Cause that's how we talked about like last episode, we talked about pitfalls in the sciences. We talked about things we see all the time with students. They make the same mistakes and we're like, oh my goodness, let's change those things. Jack, Molly, I would love to hear from both of you. Like, what are some things, especially, and I have some thoughts on this too. What are some things that like are some pitfalls you see students always making, some mistakes that you always see students when it's specifically with cars making that you're like, please, if we just adjusted that thing. Well, I mean, Molly, what would you think?
So I think one of the first things is what we've been talking about, which is getting bored and zoning out, right? Like if you don't even give the passage a chance, you're obviously never going to get any of the questions right. Once we've established, okay, you know what? I'll do my best, right? I heard what Jack was saying about being a good listener. I was hearing this discussion. Okay, now I'm willing to try. I think the next biggest thing is treating it just like a science passage, right? If you haven't seen our episode or our most recent episode on how to review a science passage, I'll quickly recap. Basically, you want to make sure you're figuring out what was mentioned and where, but you're free to go back to the passage whenever you want, right? You're expected to need to go back to the passage because not only are you responsible for all of this detailed text and data and research design, but you're also responsible for connecting it to everything that you know and have studied over the past couple months, right? So it's an expectation. You're not necessarily required to truly understand every single word in a science passage when you read it the first time. Not that we're skimming it or skipping the passage, but it's okay to go back, right? It's basically reference material. I think when you try and do that in cars, we get some big problems, right? Because ultimately, cars is not testing on the same thing as science. Again, they're not trying to see if you can unpack a giant signaling cascade. They're not trying to see if you can comprehend the blot that's in front of you. They're trying to figure out how good are you at listening, right? How good are you at divorcing yourself from this interaction and taking the thing at face value? So the thing that I think a lot of students struggle with is that cars is not about those specifics. It's not about the specifics that are mentioned. It's about the bigger ideas, the themes that are in there, the main idea of the passage. And that is very difficult to ascertain if we're skimming it and then going back to the passage later. Because ultimately, the passage as a whole is much more than a sum of its parts. And if you go back and you try and just scan for a particular word, you'll probably fall for a lot of the traps that AMC leaves for you in cars, right? Again, critical analysis and reasoning skills. They want to see if you're thinking critically. They don't want to see if you can go back to the passage. They know you can. You do it in science all the time, right? This is a very different section. So I think approaching it in a way that's unique to cars is very important. And I think a lot of students don't do that. And Jack, since we have you here, which is such a privilege, I would love to know how you came upon this strategy that we have, just in terms of how you decided to structure it this way to help students get ready to identify those broader ideas rather than just going back and searching for a word in the passage like science is.
Sure. So I think it's interesting because most people think, oh, we have, Jack Weston car strategies. They're magical. There's nothing magical about it, right? The one thing I've realized is that there are common pitfalls, and so these strategies try to counteract or prevent you from falling into those, right?
Mhm.
So that's where the strategies are derived from. Is okay. I've noticed over the years students make the same exact mistakes over and over again. There's a pattern there. So why don't I teach specific things to make sure that doesn't happen? That's where our strategies come from. And not only do we teach that in the cars in our cars course in our complete course, right? Live online courses, but also our tutors know this, right? Our tutors are trained on these strategies. They know how to help students really pinpoint one-on-one their weaknesses and prevent them from happening based on those strategies. They're all trained on those strategies. So, what are those pitfalls, right? Well, number one is most students don't read the passage. They'll read the paragraph in a skimmed way. They'll look for keywords. They'll read the questions before they read the passage. They'll do everything they can to avoid reading the passage, right? So that's number one. Don't do that. They'll never work. There are no shortcuts to reading, to doing well. You have to actually read the passage and understand it. Okay, now when I say that, I know what most students are thinking. They're thinking, "Oh, I don't have time. I don't have
Yep.
time. There's
Yep.
not enough time to read these passages." Um, I think that's the next big mistake is you're worried about the wrong thing. Let's just say I gave you unlimited time. Close your eyes. Imagine you have unlimited time, right? On this test. You can have 2 hours per passage. You can't cheat, can't look at your phone, but imagine I gave you 2 hours per passage. Would you get every question right at this point? The answer is probably no if you're honest with yourself. And if the answer is no, why are you worried about the timer? It doesn't make sense. You can't get the right answers without the timer. Why are you worried about the timer at this point? Right? And so my philosophy is let's focus on accuracy. Let's understand the passage and let's understand how to get to the right answer before we worry about the timer, right? Because that's the inherent problem here. And we all make excuses as to why we can't do well on cars. We say it's the timer or because the passage is boring. Well, that's partly true. It is boring and you're not reading it and you're pressured and you're stressed and you're worried about the timer. And so you're distracting yourself from actually doing what you need to do. The other issue I see is like Amal, you hit the nail on the head. Everyone treats it like a science passage. You're not reading a textbook. You're not supposed to read it and write notes down and remember everything they said. Okay. Well, technically you do need to remember what they said, but you're not reading it as the truth. Okay. I think that's really hard for students to understand is cars is about having a conversation. And just like any conversation you have with your friends, your brothers, your sisters, your family, you may decide they're wrong. They may be wrong, right? And so it's such a shift in thinking and approaching cars because we're all trained to read and listen to the professor, and everything the professor says is right. And if the professor says this, it's right. It's going to be on my test. That's not the case for cars. Cars is all about arguments, ideas, and understanding those ideas and figuring out how do they support those ideas? Are those ideas weakly supported, strongly supported? do I agree with those ideas? Do I disagree with those ideas? Actually engaging with the author and but not putting in your own ideas at the same time. You can't inject your own opinions, but you can have an opinion about what the author says. That's fine, right? And so there is this fine line that we have to be careful of. But understanding that not everything that author says is true or can be true, and that at the end of the day we have to take it at face value and be careful with it. And so that's another major stepping stone. The other one, I think this is huge, is rationalization. I see this all the time where a student looks at an answer and thinks about why it's right. That is a big no-no in cars. That's something we don't train students to do, right? We don't look at an answer and go, well, I like answer B because in the paragraph they said this and that. You're going down a really bad rabbit hole that you can't get out of if you do that, right? And so that's why we train our students to do process of elimination. Think about why things are wrong, not right. And so there's just so much to cover here, but I'm happy to go in any direction you want. But those are the general pitfalls, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's so great that you brought up that year after year we see the same mistakes. I know, like, again, we've been teaching for years now collectively. I think between us, maybe there's like 20 years of teaching, probably more.
Yeah.
But like it's so interesting. I ask the same question every single year. Who here's made X mistake? Who,
Mm.
I love doing like, oh, stuck between two and chooses the wrong one. Or the idea that, oh, maybe you thought you had the right answer, but when you looked at the solution, you don't understand why the right answer is right. I see these same mistakes every single year because the exam is designed in a way for you to make those mistakes. And I think that brings us, like, I think that's one of the biggest pitfalls when it comes to going into cards is people don't have a strategy. Like, I know a lot of students kind of just jump into it, like, I'm just gonna read it. Or, like you said, skip the passage and like try to cheat into the questions. Or maybe they're just gonna like, hey, I'm just gonna read this like a book, like read this like normally. But not going in with a plan leads you to make those mistakes. So I think having a game plan is huge. I think one thing you also said that really resonated with me, like in terms of my struggles with cars, is justifying. Oh my goodness. I would always try to look for the right answer when I first started, and I would always get so frustrated. So frustrated because I can't rationalize some of these answer options. I can't look for the right answer sometimes because the passage makes me lead into, oh, wanting to choose one answer when in reality there's something wrong about it. There's something where I'm making an assumption. I am introducing my own biases. So that process of elimination strategy is there to cut your biases, cut your assumptions out, and now you're limiting based on fact, based on what is true. And I think that's so huge when it comes to cars and reviewing your car's passages. Because
Yeah.
when you're reviewing, right, you're always looking for, I think, why the right answer is right. I think Molly, I think this is something we see a lot of times with our students, right? I mean, what are your thoughts when you see students doing something like that?
So, I mean, yeah, totally agree. Process elimination is key because so many students justify. And I almost feel like a really interesting way to view cars is to be like a detective, right? Like Jack, you brought up that not every author is going to present an argument that you agree with, right? Like this is different from sciences because they could be wrong. You could completely disagree with what they're saying. I feel like accepting that, some students are going to be like, if there's not an objectively correct answer, there is. You might not agree with it. It's their answer is what is objectively correct for the question, but it allows you to basically engage like a detective would. You're searching out the things that they believe in that may or may not be true. That's what is going to be important for those questions, right? So when we get into the questions, we start talking about process of elimination versus justification. So basically, process of elimination is why is this answer wrong? Maybe you find the right answer and you say, you know what? I can't eliminate this. Not this is the perfect answer and I love this. This is perfectly correct. It's I don't see anything wrong enough that I could eliminate. That's your mindset with process of elimination when you find the right answer. When we're justifying, we're basically saying, oh, this is mostly right. Like I could see why this might be the right answer. The problem is because these are all opinion-based passages, if you sat there and tried hard enough, you could justify any single one of them, right? Like if I considered an opposite perspective, this could be correct. If I considered a perspective of someone that maybe was talking about something slightly different, this would be true. Like there are reasons why people draw connections that aren't there. And when we use process of elimination, we give ourselves the freedom to again kind of be detectives. Here's an answer. I'm not trying to figure out why it's right or why it matches the passage. It takes a lot of brain power and again, will lead you astray. Rather, I'm going to go in with my little magnifying glass and find the one word or one phrase that makes this answer wrong. Right? You're switching your mindset. I'm not where's the correct answer? It's where is the little thing that makes this wrong? And oftentimes what we see, especially when working with tutoring students that will come to us with like, I don't understand this particular question, or office hours, or even in a CARS workshop, right, where we go through a passage start to finish. Oftentimes students will bring a particular question with the answer that they chose, and I'll look at it and be like, okay, I recognize 90% of this answer is consistent with the passage. They're like, this is the main idea of the passage. And you're like, it is, except, did you see that word always?
Mm-hmm.
Did they say
Extreme.
it was
Yeah.
always true?
Mm-hmm.
No. They made that claim, but you're adding a word in here that is twisting it. It's taking it too far. And I think once you accept that, not that they're trying to trick you, that makes it seem insidious, but you need to know that they are trying to see if you are thinking critically. They're trying to see if you're being critical, right? You have to be mean. I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of us as pre-meds are very nice. We want to
Something
think
we
of
talked
ourselves
about
as
last time, right?
very
Yeah.
altruistic. Yeah, but we're not nice. We're mean. We're mean. We're critical is the better word for it. So get out those magnifying glasses, so to speak, right? And make sure,
Scalpels.
yeah, that
Yeah.
you are looking for the things that make that answer wrong rather than what makes the answer right. Or how could I think about this differently such that this actually does make sense?
You know,
That's another thing you check at the door.
I want to go into like like an expert at something. Like if you're an expert at anything, what like you could be a professional football player, like soccer player,
Mhm.
or professional basketball player, or a violinist or pianist. I think what separates the experts from, the ones that are just starting off are the details, right? The experts are so careful, they're so critical of every single action they make that it makes them really strong at it. And so the hard part about cars is it feels like it's a different language. Yes, it's English. It's English, but it's different than the sciences. It's not as easy as just knowing the terms and understanding the math, right? It really is its own beast. And so what I encourage everyone that's listening to this podcast to do is get used to reading and get used to understanding that language and slowly building your focus and your discipline to be a master at this section. You can do it. If you work on this every single day, you're going to start noticing nuances. You're going to start noticing those words and being more careful of things. But if your mind is all over the place and you're just worried and stressed, you're not going to get there, right? So my number one piece of advice, chill out. Okay? Just take it easy, right?
Just chill. Just
Just
relax.
chill and just read the passage. And just read the passage. Understand what the author is saying. I don't care if it's line by line. I don't care if it's sentence by sentence. Okay. If you're overwhelmed, just your goal is read the paragraph and then take a break and then read another paragraph and then take a break. Like I think we make it harder and bigger in our head because we're not used to reading, right? Let's face it, as pre-meds, we probably don't read as often as we should. And so, or maybe we're ESL and we're afraid of English in general, right? We're grammar and vocab. And by the way, this is not a vocab test and it's not a grammar test.
Yeah.
And so if you've been able to get to this point where you're studying for the MCAT, you definitely have the college level reading that's required for the car section. So it's not that. It's all about you and your mental shift to acknowledge and allow yourself to take in this information. I think it really does start with the psychology part of this test, which is I'm ready to embrace this difficult challenge of reading something that I don't like from someone I don't know. Right. And I think that if you can get your mind to that point, everything else becomes a lot easier. You start noticing these little things, right? And so, yeah, focus and discipline, really important.
I love that. Yeah, and I think it's wonderful to give specific advice. Like if you are recognizing that you're struggling with cars and you can't find the ideas, like Jack said, take it sentence by sentence, take it paragraph by paragraph, break it up, but practice the reading, right? This is not meant to be, you know, a geography test or a history test or political science test. It's none of those things. It's a reading test, right? Can you read and understand while you read? And what I've seen, and I know you guys have seen it too, is a lot of students get so overwhelmed and they think either what is said doesn't really matter. Let me go straight to the questions, or every single word is equally as important as every other word. And like every tiny little sentence, every tiny little word is like of critical importance. And if I don't get it, I should just read and reread and reread and reread until I get it, right? Like I need to be the expert on this topic. And really, neither of those are going to serve us very well, right? It's kind of the Goldilocks zone in the middle, which is where we want to be, which is I want to
Right.
be reading carefully and intentionally. I want to be looking for the things that teach me about the author and their perspectives, but I don't want to fall into this trap of getting too stuck when the
Yeah.
author uses really complex language or when the author is convoluting something very deeply, right? One tip that I've given students in the past that really start to overanalyze and right like I guess use those intellectual scalpels too much with the sentence is if that's something you struggle with, read a sentence as slow as you want. I don't care if you read one word in a minute, right? Read the sentence as slow as you want. But then the second that you reach the period, close your eyes or look away. What was the sentence about?
Oh,
You
great.
can't look back. You cannot look back. Your eyes are closed. You're looking away. What was it about? If you can't tell me, either you're not reading slow enough or you're not reading intentionally. Try again, right? You don't want to go into this trap of constantly going back and rereading the passage because, again, it'll lead you down a path towards a trap, right? So pause, look away. What was it about? If you can't tell me, we need to adjust our strategy. Sometimes that can help as we're starting to relearn how to read in a way that can shape you the way that we need to be to succeed in cars.
I think that also comes to like another thing we talk about so much here at Jack Weston, which is reading like the common person, right? Because these passages talk about all these subjects we've talked about before, like philosophy, history, literature, economics, right? Like I remember I saw a passage about like minimalistic nihilism. I don't know anything about minimalistic nihilism.
Yeah. What?
So they go into all these nuances, and I see students get so overwhelmed by all these things that they don't know about these different nuances. But like we've said, it's not about the details. You read slowly, right? And then you look away, right? I suggest this all the time. Sometimes when I'm with a tutoring student, especially like early sessions on, I ask them to read and then I stop them. I cut them off and say, "What did you just read?" Look away, what did you just read? And they can't say it. Because a lot of times we just end up reading, reading, reading without actually digesting. And so
Right.
if we're reading slowly, right? And we're reading intentionally, we should be able to say, okay, what did I just read? But then we can also understand, hey, if I read it slowly and I read it intentionally, yet I still didn't understand it, maybe I'm not supposed to understand it. Maybe it's not common person. If what we say call a common person is like the regular average person on the street, the regular average person doesn't know about minimalistic nihilism. So if you read that sentence and you're like, this is a lot of stuff I don't know, and it's all these details, you're probably not meant to understand it. Right? As long as you get the overarching idea. I mean, maybe you don't understand the nuances, but how does the author feel about those nuances? Do they feel good? Do they feel bad about it? Okay, great, then move on. Right? I think there's this kind of duality, right? Like you said, where we don't want to be reading too quickly, but we also we're overlooking all these things, but we want to read slowly enough to understand the difference between what I'm supposed to know and what I'm not supposed to know.
So I love that. It's ironic because everyone's thinking right now, I can't read slow. I don't have time,
Mhm.
right? But you don't like, the tortoise and the hare, right? Who ends up finishing faster, right? The turtle, right? And so if you're slower at reading, you make less mistakes reading because you understand what you're reading. You prevent bad habits like rereading, which
Mhm.
which does take you more time to read the passage. You end up understanding the questions. you you end up understanding the answers, you get stuck less, right? It's an investment. It's an investment. You put something up front to hopefully benefit from it later. That's what an investment is, right? And so that's you have to do that. You have to invest and read slowly. I know that sounds crazy, but if you are able to do that and actually pay attention and be intentional, you will end up finishing faster and with a higher score. The other thing that, I really want to touch on here is this idea of like timing again, because again, like it's so important that you just disregard it. Like when you're doing a passage, I want you to time yourself, but don't constantly look at the clock, because that's a distraction. You're not listening to the author, right? And so the best analogy I can give for a Cars passage where it has that duality, right, is imagine you have a professor teaching you something really complicated, and it's philosophy or something in the humanities or whatever. And let's say you go into an elevator with that professor. Somehow you guys end up in the same elevator, and that elevator gets stuck. So you're stuck in an elevator with a professor, right? That you don't really know well. And you guys just open up a conversation. You guys start chatting about the professor's job and their interests and their field of work. And that professor is going to be talking a lot about things that you don't understand. But at the end of the day, you need to have a conversation with that professor, right? You don't want to look bad, right? And so you need to pick up on certain things the professor says, right? You may not understand all of it, but you're paying attention and you're trying your best, right? Most students just flat out stop talking to the professor and turn around. That's what they're doing in a Cars passage, right? You can't do that. You can't give up. You're talking to a professor. You're in that elevator. You're stuck in there. You can't open the door. You have to carry on, right? And you can't stop and say, "Wait a second, professor. Can you go back 3 sentences and tell me what you said?" You need to be completely focused and try your best to understand whatever you can. I promise you, the MCAT, they're really good at making you only pick up the most important parts, right? It's a psychological like game. You can't get intimidated because you don't understand everything. You can't have that perfectionist mentality. You need to continue as if, there are still stuff I can use to help me answer the questions if I continue at a slow pace that is reasonable, right? And so that analogy I think makes the most sense for what you're actually doing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I love it. I don't think I've heard you use that analogy before, Jack, but that is so insightful in so many different ways. Um, because it calls back to being a good listener, like we started our discussion with. Again, you may not know everything about what that person is telling you in terms of the nitty-gritty details, but that doesn't mean that you can't be a good listener, right? Like the professor is not expecting you to be also a professor of that material, right? But they are expecting you to be able to have a conversation. They're expecting you to be able to pick up on at least the basics of what they're saying. They're expecting you to pick up, like you said, on, how they feel about different theories or concepts, right? Like there's so much you can glean from a conversation when you view it as such, even if you're not an expert about it, right? And that is an odd thing to be doing, right? Like I want to be an expert. I'm used to, as a pre-med, always being an expert and always knowing all this stuff about my field of interest. But at the end of the day, in this analogy, Jack, this could be any type of professor, right? This doesn't have to be a science professor. It could be an archaeology professor or I was going to say a physics professor. It could be a psychology professor or a history professor. The same tools apply, regardless of who you're talking to. Again, they may know stuff that you don't, but that doesn't mean that you can't listen and engage. Um, and I think that brings us to another really important point, which is every single Cars passage should be approached the same way, because every single Cars passage is going to be using ideas and terminology that you probably won't be familiar with, right? Your job doesn't change if you're reading a history or a theater or a dance or a philosophy passage. It's the exact same goal, which is exactly what we're talking about. You show up with the tools that you have to dissect and learn and understand and engage in this conversation. You glean what you can from the passage. You don't dive in too deep and overwhelm yourself, right? You need to be reading at the same level, regardless of the passage, regardless of this is a passage that's incredibly opinionated, or maybe dissecting different conflicting ideas, or maybe it's one that doesn't seem like it has any ideas or arguments at all, right? You're doing the same thing in that elevator with the professor or staring at your computer screen with cars, right? What tools do I have in my tool belt to help me unpack what is being said? Because I can't go back. I can't rewind real life and go back and re-listen to something that they had to say. And I don't want to go back and reread, since that's actually going to take me a lot longer than reading intentionally the first time, like the tortoise and hare you were mentioning, right? What do I have that I can use available to me right now to unpack any Cars passage? And that's kind of the fun of Cars, right? In science, you may be stronger in chemistry than psychology, right? Your background may be stronger in certain areas than others. And because of that, because you do have to bring that knowledge, there will be certain types of passages that will always be tricky for you until you go in and you gain that understanding, right? It's different from Cars because you are expected to be an expert on that, right? You are expected to be able to bring that knowledge. The beauty, I guess the double-edged sword of Cars is that every single passage should be approached the same way. When you don't have a strategy, that feels horrible because you're wrong in every single passage the way that you're approaching it. But once you can build a strategy that makes sense, again, you learn how to use that toolkit and you keep adding tools to it, right? Now, suddenly Cars make sense. And suddenly, of the 9 passages that are in a Cars section, you know how to unpack all of them, right? It's not that you have to put in all of these or put in all of this different kind of content and different types of passage practice, right? You will see different types of passages, different passage personalities, so to speak, but every single one of them will use the same tools, right? So Cars, it's worth putting in the time and the effort to learn, because ultimately, once you kind of have that aha moment, once you relearn how to read effectively, right? Now you have the capacity to score higher on all 9 in the section. So that's one of the reasons I love working about Cars the most.
That's something you said something that's like super critical to me when it comes to Cars, and part of what helped me improve, like when I started with Cars, I was like a 123, 124 score in Cars, like even lower sometimes. I would like range. Sometimes every once in a while I get like a 5 out of 6, but usually I'm scoring like a 2 out of 6, 3 out of 7 kind of deal in Cars. But the major difference when it comes to Cars is every passage, I just have a game plan. It's funny when I talk with students, tutoring students, or when we're in the courses, like I teach a lot of the live online courses. A lot of the students are like, Mike, you're such an amazing reader. Like, how do you read so? Like, I'm not a great reader. I don't think I'm particularly a strong reader. I'm going to be honest. I read a lot of Cars passages, but the great thing is I just know how to do the same thing every time. It's always the same thing every time. I think tutoring students, I think sometimes get sick of me repeating it, where they're like, Mike, this Cars passage, right? It was so different. Then we're like, okay, let's break it apart.
It's the same
And we
thing.
do it the exact same way
Yep.
every single time. And I find a lot of comfort in that. Because
Mhm.
depending on the science passages, right? Maybe you see a science passage where, oh, you don't know the content as well. Or you see, oh, maybe there's a lot of calculations. I don't like calculations. But that's one of the really comforting things about Cars, where
Yes.
I know every single passage is going to be the exact same thing. I'm going to go into it with my plan. I know exactly what to look for. I know exactly what to be picking out, and I know exactly how to go through my questions. It's funny. I was working with a tutoring student recently, and she had taken the exam before and struggled a lot when she was working on her own, and she was convinced that she was a poor reader. Convinced. But the problem wasn't her reading. The problem was she didn't have a game plan, right? As soon as we started, it was such a great 180, right? And she even listens to this podcast, so hey. um, but as soon as she started actually having a game plan going into this, she was like, I can actually enjoy the passages now, because now I'm not so distracted about like, oh, what am I going to do differently this time? What do I have to focus on? If you have the game plan and you know exactly what you're going to do, now you can actually enjoy these passages. And when you enjoy the passage, kind of cliche, but when you enjoy the passages, you're more likely to pay attention to them. You more likely to be engaged to pick out what you need so you can effectively tackle these questions. So, so I think that's one a big pitfall where, and I think I mentioned this before, where we don't have a game plan, but maybe we have a game plan, we change it. No, it's the exact same plan every single time. That's the beauty about cars. It's just do the same thing over and over again.
I'm gonna just step in here and say, if you don't know what to do for cars and you're constantly changing your strategy, like you said, Michael, it's all about just being consistent with a strategy, right? And that strategy doesn't have to be perfect, but pick a strategy and go with it. If you need help with that, I host a free live cars session every Tuesday night right now. We always have one every night, every week. We have a cars live session where we teach strategies, the fundamentals. And so if you're not sure how to start, and this is great, even if you're not even close to studying for the MCAT and you're just thinking about it, it's not bad to get into a car session to start reading our daily passages with a strategy. And so I'd love for you to join our session one day this month, or next month, and just figure out a common strategy that might work for you. And I think you'll be very surprised with how much you'll learn about cars. I do encourage you to at least try some cars passages on your own first to see how hard it can be to begin with. But when you learn that strategy, you're going to want to lean on it as much as possible. The other thing I want to add, and I think this is really important, is that a lot of students, and rightfully so, very smart, very hardworking students, have this fear of failure. And so they don't study cars because they're so scared they won't do well. And if that's you, please talk to me. Please talk to us, right? We have academic advisors to guide you, to support you, to give you that assurance. We deal with this all the time. I see students with 3.9, 4.0, top of their class. They're able to do everything, but the MCAT stops them, right? Literally stops them for years. And if you can't figure it out, we have resources. We have free resources. We have premium resources to help you, right? And so reach out to an academic advisor, one of our staff, and we can guide you, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, you have to help yourself. You have to actually put in the time and energy to really figure this out. And as long as you do, you'll be there. You'll get there. Don't tell yourself that you're weak at this, that you suck at this, that you hate this, because those are all signs that you're not prepared enough, that you haven't put in the right effort. I'm not saying you haven't put in the effort, because I'm sure you have the right effort to move forward. It's crazy, but you don't need as much time as you think to improve, right? Weeks can help you improve points, many, many points, right? Just a couple of weeks, right? And so have that mentality of, hey, I can do this. I just need to learn exactly what to do, right? And I'm not going to just give up. That mentality is so, so important. So I'm excited. I'm excited to hear you guys in our live sessions, to hear your stories in our advising sessions. So, yeah, it's gonna be
Love.
great.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something so important, which is how emotionally difficult cars can be, right? Like you said, I think, and as we've all kind of been saying, cars is one of the most mental sections of this. It's not just your knowledge. It's not your actual facts and data that you've memorized for the exam. Hopefully more so understood. Go see us in past episodes if you want to talk about how to understand something rather than just memorize it. But it is, again, being comfortable in that discomfort of not knowing every detail about whatever topic is being discussed, but relying on that toolkit that you've been building. I think as we first start to engage with cars, we don't have any tools in our toolkit, right? We don't have any strategies here, and it can be so defeating, especially when we come to cars with a perfectionist mindset, right? Which, let's be honest, probably 95% of us have. We tie our identity and our value to our academic performance, right? It can motivate us for sure, but it can also be incredibly damaging and limiting, especially in cars, because there's nothing to save you, right? There's no content to lean on. It's all your strategy. It's all your ability to dissect and read, and that can be incredibly uncomfortable. And like we've said, sometimes that leads us to hide from it, right? Or to deflect and put up these defense mechanisms of cars is unfair, cars doesn't matter anyways. It's okay that I'm not reading effectively because it doesn't matter or because it's a rigged thing anyways. It's very uncomfortable to admit cars does matter, and there are ways to read it effectively. I just don't have those skills yet, right? It's scary because that means that we have to step away from that definition of our identity and our value based on our academic performance, right? But it's critical. And I think when I've seen the students have that, I don't want to call it an overnight success because it's not. It's oftentimes months of work with the mental block. If we could get you past that mental block, then you already have the tools to use. It's always students who don't believe in themselves, right? Because I've seen students do this. And I mentioned last episode, I was working with a student in one of my office hours that had been studying our strategies for months and who did pretty well on timed practice. She was using a stopwatch that counted up. So she was doing, 15, 20 minutes for a passage, and she only ever did one in a row. And then she would review it untimed, and she would do really poorly. Like the more time she gave herself, the worse she would do. And I'm like, what is going on with this student? I'm like, okay, I want you to try some passages in 10 minutes. 10 minutes per passage, that's test day timing. I just want to see what happens. She very literally went from like a 50% accuracy to a 90% accuracy because the more time she gave herself, the more doubt she would let in, the more her mindset of, I'm not good at this, I'm never going to improve, would limit her. It's like having someone standing over her shoulder checking her work. She came to me the next week and was like, I am blown away because I didn't realize that if I didn't give myself the time and space to let that doubt in, how good I actually could be at this, right? And every student's different with what specifically they may need to get past that sort of mental block or barrier. Again, like Jack said, that's why we're here, right? That's why we have our free sessions that we do every single week. Definitely go to Jack's. That is amazing. Definitely go check him out. And, again, you can engage with him. You can ask him questions, which is so wonderful. You can also do that in the comments, right? Contact us. Let us know that you have particular questions. We'd be happy to address them. But you have to be an advocate for yourself and what you need, right? So that's going to come from finding a strategy. Again, we will happily share our fundamentals with you. Just come see us, right? But to bring us back to our initial goal, which is how to review cars, you can also start to build these strategies and do that process of self-reflection to identify what might be kind of causing you the most trouble in cars in the review process. Very few people are good at cars right out the gate, right? It comes from being comfortable in the discomfort of not being good at something, being okay with that. But I'd love to get into, let's say we just did some passages. Let's say we just did a full length. We need to unpack and start to kind of reverse engineer a car's strategy based on what passages we just did, right? So I'd love to pose it to you guys. Assuming someone just did a car's full length section, how can they start to put the pieces together of this might be something I'm struggling in? So I should develop this kind of a strategy. What do you guys think? Jack, maybe if you could help us shed some light on this.
So like just understanding how to review or what exactly?
Yeah, like once we've done a passage, let's say that we understand the fundamentals that we've just talked about, right? So we know the purpose of cars. We know how, on a basic level, how we should be reading, we should be engaging, looking for arguments. Let's say a student just took a full length. How should they start to unpack that? How should they move forward with that full length to start to understand what limitations they may have with the strategies they're using?
So I would say reviewing is absolutely critical. And the way I would review is I would do the same passage twice before I know the answers. So I
Mhm.
can see how consistent I really am. That's, I think, the most important thing. So I would do it once under timed conditions, and then I do it again, right, without knowing the scores. That's why we call it like a blind review. We don't know the scores. Do it again, and I would write down my answers. I wouldn't look at how I might remember what I picked my first time around, but I'm not going to let that dictate my answers the second time around. I'm free to change my answers. And then I would actually understand or reflect on how I got to that answer the first time and how I got to that answer the second time. And where did I deviate? And should there have been deviations, right? Did I do something wrong the first time or the second time? Did I do something right the first time or the second time? You'll start noticing trends if you start doing things twice. You won't notice it the first time because it's too quick and you might forget what you've done. But if you do it twice, you'll remember, oh yeah, I remember I saw that the first time and here's how I answered it. Let me see if I want to do it the same way this time. Right? And so there's an element of reviewing that requires reflection, that requires thinking and understanding and also looking at the solutions and figuring out, okay, what is the right answer and why is that right? And am I going towards that answer every time? Right? And you'll see these, it sounds weird, but most questions are the same in like they ask questions around the same things, right? What is the main idea? What is the tone? What strengthens or weakens this argument? And so if you can start noticing those patterns through reviewing, doing that blind review, doing it twice, I think you're going to be really effective at finding a clear strategy that works for you.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think the blind review is something that a lot of students don't expect to do, especially because so many students are concerned with time, right? And I want to just acknowledge, like, we know how busy you guys are. We've been in your shoes, right? So many of us are juggling so many conflicting roles and conflicting sets of responsibilities. That being said, cars, there's no content to learn, right? There's no content to learn at all. However, it's a very important part of your prep, right? It's a huge part of your score. If you consider cars as a subject, it is the subject that has the most questions on it. More than bio, more than biochem, more than psych, soc, gen chem, ochem, physics, any of that. It is the highest yield thing on the MCAT, right? So don't be afraid to do this blind review, right? It is really the only way that you could start to put the pieces together on what we might need to work on and develop for yourself, right? So do the passage first under timed conditions. Again, if you're really early in your prep, fine, start a stopwatch that counts up, right? Just start to introduce time pressure however you can, but get that timed practice. And then when you're done, okay, get up, walk a lap around the block, grab some coffee, some water, do whatever you need to do for a moment, come back and sit with, okay, let me reread the passage. Is there anything that jumps out at me now that didn't before, right? Is that good or bad? Was this something that really doesn't matter, that mattered to me when I first read it or now? Like, how is my reading different? And then go to each question. And I like to say, again, you might think it takes a long time. It really doesn't. See if you can anticipate what the solution will say for the question. You don't know if you got it right or wrong, but reread the question. Did I truly understand what the question was asking me when I read it the first time? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? Let's say you did. Okay, now go through our answers, right? Why did I eliminate every answer that I eliminated, right? What was my reasoning for it? Why could, why are they all worse than the answer I picked? Do all of those things so that you know exactly why you chose the answer you did. When you look at the solution, you now have your thoughts and your processing and then theirs. And now you have things to compare. A lot of the times, I guess this will be my big pitfall I'll share with Cars Review is we read the passage, right? We do the passage the first time, we submit, we look, oh shoot, I did really poorly on this passage. Okay, let me go in and look. And I go straight, refresh really quick with the question. Oh yeah, I remember this one. Go straight to the solution. And then you see something that maybe you remember, maybe you don't. And you say to yourself either, oh, I would have gotten this next time and move on and give up. Or say, I was never going to get this because you don't even remember what you were reading. You don't remember what you were thinking when you read, right? You might have been almost there to the correct answer, but you don't remember. So you're going to say either I'd get it next time if I saw this question again, nothing to learn, I'm perfect. Obviously, not going to improve then. Or you're going to say, I was never going to get this right. This is gibberish. This is unfair. And you're going to give up anyways, right? Refresh yourself on how you read it and why you chose the answer you did ultimately before you look at the solutions so that you actually have a way to figure out what you did and what we could do differently next time. That's a big thing in my eyes.
I think especially knowing why the others are wrong. I think
Yeah.
that key alone is what a lot of people miss in the review, right? Is did I really eliminate the other answer options? Or did I choose this one because I thought it was right? I think
Mm,
a lot of the times we do the thing, we do our strategies where, and again, I see a lot with students where they're like, I'm doing my JW strategies, I'm going to eliminate, and they choose an answer. But then when they look and when they do their review, right, they're always looking at why the right answer is right. Right. But a lot of the times, and sometimes with cars, hey, I'm going to be the first one to admit it. Sometimes I don't like the right answer. Sometimes I don't see why it's right. But I can tell you, it's not wrong. There's nothing wrong about it. And so a lot of the times in the review, people are looking at the correct answer for the review and say, oh, why the right answer is right. And trying to think, oh, that's what I need to study. That's what I need to focus on. Oh, I should change my mindset to think that way. When in reality, I don't think we should. Because again, you're trying to fundamentally change how you think, and that's not really realistic. But I like comparing how you thought to the incorrect answer options. Because if you got it right, did you eliminate for the right reasons? Did you pick up that it was extreme, or did you just not like the answer? Well, if you miss the extreme language, that's a problem, right?
mhm.
If you got the wrong answer, you eliminated the right one. Why did you eliminate the right answer? What did you see that was wrong about it? And what did you miss with the wrong, incorrect answer option that you picked as the right answer? Right? I think reviewing in that way, making sure you're looking for what's wrong and not really focus. And again, this is maybe just my very radical thoughts on how skeptical I am of cars like answers because again, I was deeply scarred by it, but I'm now come back with a vengeance.
Oh
That
my.
again, there's not always going to be a right answer. Right? This is kind of the thing when it comes to cars where there is not always going to be a right answer. They do not owe you that. But what they do owe you is that there's three incorrect answer options and one answer option that isn't incorrect. It's not right. It doesn't have to be right. It's just not wrong.
I love that. I always tell students the right answer sucks,
Mhm.
right? But the other answers are definitely wrong.
Worse.
So yeah, and that's what I mean, Jack. Like, why are we looking to figure out why that awful answer is right?
Right.
Stop, right? Let's look
They do
why.
that on purpose. They don't want you to just look for the right answer. That's too easy,
Mm,
right? They
it's not
would rather
critical.
it's not
Mhm.
critical. The way they know that you actually thought about it is if you're able to deduce why the other three are bad,
Yeah.
right? And they can't be right. And so I always see students saying, "How could this be right? There's no way. There's no way I would have figured that out." You're not supposed to. You're really
Mhm.
not. Like,
Yeah.
I don't blame you. But you're supposed to figure out why the other three aren't right. And that is the critical part of critical reasoning, right? Critical thinking. And so yeah, I'm totally in agreement with that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. It
And
also comes back to why reading the passage again is so critical
mhm.
because a lot of students go straight to the questions and try and review, but it's going to be near impossible because these are all 100% passage based questions that they're asking you, no content here. It's going to be impossible to really recognize why certain answers are wrong if you don't know the passage arguments,
Mhm.
right? Especially when you read the solution and you see their reasoning and then you go back and look for the exact text where they said that, you're gonna be like, they didn't say that. It's like, they didn't in those words, but that's the main
Mhm.
idea of the passage, right? Make sure you do your passage read. And when you're reviewing your questions, I want you to recognize that sometimes you didn't miss the question because of the question. Sometimes you miss the question because you didn't read the passage very effectively, right?
Mhm.
You have to reread a car's passage before you look at the questions, or else you will never know why you got it wrong,
Mhm.
right? You have to know the passage and the passage arguments in order to figure out why the wrong answers are wrong and why the right answer is the least wrong. Not the
Mhm.
best, not the right one, but the least wrong. So, especially when you're feeling really exasperated about a question, make sure you're comfortable with what the passage is talking about. And if not, that's your first task. Before
Yeah.
you can understand this really complex question, you need to understand the passage. Because if you don't, you're going to be flying blind. And again, you're going to pretty easily say, I would have just gotten this next time. No big deal. I don't need to look at this anymore. Or this is super unfair. This question is lame. I don't want to look at this anymore. Either way, you move on without getting that learning opportunity. If we skip out on learning opportunities, we will never get better.
And
So
this is
something,
why, oh, sorry, Jack, but I was just going to say, this is why so many people do so much practice and don't improve. I think that is the main reason. I've seen students do every single passage in our question bank. We've got thousands of passages in our question bank. Do every single one of
For
those
free.
for
For free.
free,
By
for
the way,
free,
if you want
right?
them, they
Every
got them.
single AAMC question, every single cars passage they can get their hands on. They've done more passages than maybe I have in my life, which is shocking, and still don't improve, right? It's
right. It's all about the review, but also it's quality over quantity. So I
Mhm.
agree. You need to be consistent. You need to do a passage a day, or you have to. I always try to do like 9 in 1 week as you get closer to your test date. That's like about what you're going to be doing on the actual test, right? 9. So if you can
Mhm.
do around 9 in a week as you get closer to your test date, I think that's more than enough. And that's kind of what our course does. Is kind of gives you assignments based on how well you progress and also where you are. And so I would never recommend doing more than 9 practice passages in a week. I think it's overkill after that. But for those 9 that you end up doing, right? And you can start with just 2 a week, 3 a week, right? Or 1 a day. Um, do it well. Like, don't just jump into the next passage to make yourself feel better and see a better, to try to see a better score, right? I see this happen all the time where students go, well, I'm going to do another passage. I want to see how well I'm doing. Well, I'm going to do another one because I want to see how well I'm doing on that one. And they just think that miraculously, because they did a passage, they're going to somehow improve. It's sort of like gambling. Like you just feel like
Mm,
you just feel like you're going to get better if you just do another one, or you're going to get a better score somehow because if you just do another one more. And that's not the case. That's you have to actually put in the work and understand what went wrong for that passage. And yeah, if you don't understand the passage, like you said, Molly, it's almost impossible to understand the solutions. So if you
yeah.
need to go over the passage like 5 times, right? I don't think that's necessary, but if
Five.
you
I'm like, goodness, Jack, jeez.
I mean, I'm extreme. I'm extreme, but I would rather really, really understand the passage than move on to another passage. I
Yeah.
I need to understand this passage and understand these questions before I move on to the next. And if it takes you 2 days to review a passage, so be it, right? Like just do it well because you'll get faster.
Yeah. I feel like what's so important here is the students that say, "Oh, this passage was hard, let me just do another one," are kind of telling themselves, "The passage I just did was special.
Mm.
I needed to do something different on that passage than I'll need to do on the next one," right? I don't like that one. I want the next one. And what you're saying, Jack, is stick with the passage until you get it. And I think that exercise communicates something very different, which is what's in this passage is the same as what is in any other passage. I struggled with this one, and therefore this one is the one that's going to teach me the most about cars, right? So I think the way that we approach that with the quality over quantity really cements this idea in our head that every single passage, maybe they're not all about the same thing on the surface, but they all require the same thing of me, exactly the same thing of me, right? So on those passages that we really struggle with, it's very easy to say, well, this one was weird. This one was unique. I didn't like the way this one was phrased. I didn't like the topic. This passage was unfair. The questions were too hard. No, you are asked to do the exact same thing in this passage than you did that you were with the one you got 5 out of 6 on, right? But here you got 1 out of 6, which means the way that this was presented tripped you up, right? This is the one that's going to teach you the most, right? Spend more time on that one than the one that's 5 out of 6, right? And of course, if a particular passage makes you want to bang your head against a wall, come talk with us. We have a
Mhm.
ton of video solutions for all of our dailies and for pretty much all the AMC
Yeah.
material. So if you're really struggling in cars and a particular passage is driving you crazy, you can't get there on your own, come see us, right? We
Mhm.
have a lot of resources that can help expedite it. But nothing can replace trying on your
Mhm.
own. Nothing in the world will replace it. Even having access to all of our car strategy lectures, all of our video solutions, we can't, as much as, it would be nice, we can't do your car section for you, right? At the end of the day, you're the one who's going to have to put in the time and the effort and the discomfort, right, that comes with that growth mindset to see improvements, right?
Mhm.
We've got endless tools to help you get to that next stage and step. But ultimately, it comes from getting practice as much as you physically can and reviewing it in exactly the way that we're talking about, right? Not just taking something for granted and saying this passage was too hard. I'd never get this in the future. Good thing this passage won't be on my test. A passage just like this could be on your test. You got to be ready for it. And again, you need to learn how to use those same tools in every single passage that you see, because that's the best way to improve, and that's the best way to secure the score that you're hoping for in CARS on your test.
I think
So
that strategy application, like what you said, huge. Because I've met so many students who are like, I know the JW strategy. I know they can list it off to me, tell me all the steps. But when we go through a passage, like a harder passage, everything goes out. And they're like, oh, this, yeah, like you said, this was special, right? But it's those hard passages that our strategy actually shines the most, in my opinion. Like that's what, because again, those easier quote unquote passages, a lot of people can do fairly well on them by just justifying, by just, oh, I understood it well, so I can justify my way through it. It's not hard. There's no impetus to actually fight through the kind of the meat, the fluff. But it's with these harder passages that you need to start applying these strategies. That once you get comfortable applying it when it's extremely difficult, that's when I think that's when the real improvement happens, that you apply it every single time. Again, we were talking about last episode, like we're like a drill sergeant with the game plan. Like we have a game plan, we stick to it every single time, right? And so that's what we're saying with cars. We've got a game plan. We stick to it every single time. And if there's something stopping us from sticking to it every single time, that's what we need to figure out. And that's how we improve.
Awesome. I love
I
it.
love that. Yeah, I feel like we've covered so much ground in this episode, right? We talked about the car's mindset, like how we should be attempting to read what the goal ultimately is. We talked about how every passage is the same and asking the same things about it, or from us, right? We talked about how it's different from sciences, right? We talked about how ultimately improving in cars can help in all the other sections because it's all strategy, right? This is really where we start to develop those. We covered so much ground. I hope you guys enjoyed our cars discussion. And as you guys implement the strategies that we've talked about in this episode and the ones that we talk about in those free sessions Jack was mentioning on Tuesdays, we hope that you're going to start to recognize where those weak areas truly are in your cars practice and start to implement key strategies to counteract those weak areas and ultimately help you improve to the point where you want to be on your exam, right? So as you get practice with this and with the sciences that we've talked about in previous episodes, make sure you're tracking your score, because ultimately the thing we need to worry about next or decide about next is, when are we ready? When are we ready? How do I know if I'm ready to take my test? Right? I've been working in the sciences and in cars. I've been doing my full lengths. Maybe I'm starting to see improvement in my score. Maybe my score is starting to stabilize around where I want it. When am I ready? When should I schedule my test? What time of year? All of these questions will be handled next episode, right? So stay tuned. We're going to talk all about when to take your exam based on all of the things we've been talking about so far in this podcast. So get excited. If you missed any of our previous episodes, definitely go check them out, because this next one is going to include all of the things that we've been talking about so far. So again, get excited. Mike, Jack, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your perspective. I think students are really going to love this one.
Love it. Thanks, guys. That was awesome.
Thanks so much.